I would like to weigh in for the EU approach and then talk a little bit about how the U.S. needs to adjust its policy to try to make this approach more effective. So I would say that still striving for suspension makes sense. But it's a suspension as presented by the EU, and it's different than it's presented here. The EU says suspend until confidence is restored that Iran has a peaceful nuclear program. Then enrichment could restart. And that's been pursued in other countries. It is similar, it was pursued in Brazil, not quite as formally, but still, once Brazil decided to abandon its secret nuclear programs, peaceful nuclear explosions in 1990, then the pressure to stop its gas centrifuge program was dramatically reduced. And Brazil now is pursuing a centrifuge program. Another part of the EU approach is robust inspections in Iran, as you all know. And then to have a package of incentives. They also, in their approach, do not emphasize military action. I think they're, as you know, typically that has not been part of what they've been talking about. And they've always been willing to, in what I would call, pre-negotiate with Iran. Even now, Iran, EU will sit down with Iran and discuss these issues, even though there's no suspension. What I'd like to say, though, is that there is a reason to hold on to the suspension as a demand. And it's because other things are easier to arrange or to achieve from that point of view. And also against this background that Iran doesn't seem to be in a mood to compromise on anything. And so we should be clear about what we want. And I would say the Middle East particularly, a zone free of enrichment plants and reprocessing plants is a noble goal. And I would also say that if there is an Iranian enrichment program that's legitimized, it'll be much harder to stop enrichment programs rising in other countries. I mean, Turkey's already talked about having an uranium enrichment program. Hardly needs one. We're also, unfortunately, in a period where the emphasis has to be on increasing the political and economic pressure on Iran. And I think that's easier to do if the UN Security Council and the IA are saying we need a suspension, and that's the goal. I also think if you work for a suspension, it's easier to stop Iran from doing illicit nuclear trade. I mean, it's rarely discussed, but Iran built its industry in the nuclear area, fuel cycle, on illicit nuclear trade. And that effort continues. It's out there seeking items for its gas centrifuge program from Western suppliers and needs those items to expand its centrifuge program, particularly if we're talking about 6,000 centrifuges, 10,000 more centrifuges. And it wants dual-use items, and it routes those items through UAE, Turkey, China, and it's a perpetual struggle to try to stop that illicit trade. And again, with the suspension or a centrifuge program that isn't viewed as legitimate, it's easier to do that. Now, I think the discussion in Washington is very different. I mean, just to give an example of sanctions, I think in the EU context, the sanctions are much more multilateral in the way they're formulated. They're aimed at Iran, where here, I think there was a theory today on applying more sanctions to the companies that deal with Iran. In essence, create laws here to press our allies or punish our allies if they continue to do trade with Iran, which they're going to continue to do because there's many legitimate reasons to trade with Iran. I think in the United States, that's viewed differently, but still, for many of our allies, they are going to continue to trade, and this is about nuclear and other WMD and ballistic missile, and the sanctions should be more targeted, and we should be seeking cooperation with our allies, not seeking ways to punish them. And so I would say that an adjustment here is to move away from the imposition of unilateral sanctions. The U.S. has made progress. I mean, when we started this at ISIS, I mean, the administration was just throwing stones at the EU offer. It was viewed as a horrible thing. That certainly changed over time. But the United States still needs to do more. And I would say that the NIE was not a flawed document. Certainly it was presented in a way that was not very helpful. But underneath it was a realization that they'd been wrong to continuously say that Iran had an active nuclear weapons program and to pick fights about it. I mean, every 3 months at the Board of Governors meeting in Vienna, there was a fight between the U.S. team and the IA over whether there was evidence of an active nuclear weapons program. And so in that sense, the NIE came into alignment with the view among much of the world that yes, probably something happened in the past, but unclear if it was going on now, and extremely hard to prove in any case. But the bottom line was the suspension is aimed at a future breakout capability in Iran. And that's the real risk. That the centrifuge program, the heavy water reactor, and reprocessing program are the real risk, and those need to be suspended in a negotiation with Iran. And so I think the NIE is, in a sense, has cleared the air on a technical, factual level, and I think it's a good thing. Another change in the U.S., and let me just make these quickly, I'll get done in time, that the U.S. needs to spend less time thinking about military options on Iran. That they don't help. I won't go into this, very hard program to destroy militarily, unlikely to be able to do it. It's so dispersed and within Iran. And so short of a full-scale war, certainly we could launch a full-scale war and set back the problem, but is that what we want? And I would argue no. The other thing is, we need to, as Ambassador Pickering has mentioned and Dr. Blix, we need to negotiate directly with Iran. And in the EU approach, that's simple. Solano meets with the Iranians periodically. The U.S. could simply join in. There's no reason to have a precondition on the negotiation. And then there needs to be more thought about incentives to offer Iran. The EU came up with a list. Iran wasn't particularly happy with it, but certainly the incentives could be worked out, probably in a fairly happy manner between Iran and the EU and the United States, if that was truly the goal. And then the other change that I'll mention is in the U.S., there has to be an acceptance that a suspension is not a permanent cessation. That we're trying to buy some time to develop confidence that it's a peaceful program, put in structures and compromises that will build greater confidence that it's a peaceful solution. But Iran may restart a centrifuge program, and it would have our blessing. And I would say the precedent for that, although it's not quite the same level, but for over a decade, the U.S. fought the nuclear reactor. And it did everything it could to disrupt the supply of that reactor, working abroad. Now it accepts that that reactor is fine, and would even view additional reactors as part of an incentive package. So let me just end there, and thank you very much.